As a child, Sarah had always been afraid of the dark. Her parents had tried everything to get her to sleep through the night, from nightlights to soothing music, but nothing had worked. As she grew up, Sarah learned to cope with her fear by keeping herself busy during the day and avoiding being alone at night. One day, Sarah moved to a new city for work and found an apartment in an old building. It was perfect, cozy, affordable, and close to her workplace. But as soon as the sun set, she would feel uneasy. Every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind would make her heart race. It was like her childhood fear of the dark had come back to haunt her. One night, while she was lying in bed trying to fall asleep, Sarah heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She froze, listening intently. The tapping grew louder and more insistent, and Sarah realized with growing horror that someone or something was trying to get in. She tried to call the police, but her phone was dead. As she huddled under the covers, she could hear the tapping getting louder and louder until it turned into a violent banging. It felt like the entire building was shaking. And then, suddenly, the noise stopped. Sarah waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing else happened. She eventually managed to fall asleep, but the incident left her deeply unsettled. Over the next few nights, Sarah became increasingly paranoid. She would hear strange noises in the apartment, doors opening and closing on their own, and shadows moving in the corners of her vision. She felt like she was losing her mind. One night, Sarah finally worked up the courage to investigate the source of the strange occurrences. She went to the window where she had heard the tapping and saw a figure standing on the street below, staring up at her window. It was a man with a strange smile on his face, and Sarah knew instinctively that he was responsible for the terrifying experiences she had been having. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the man had disappeared. Sarah moved out of the apartment the next day, but she never forgot the feeling of being watched in the sense that something deeply sinister had been lurking in the shadows of her own mind. There was a woman named Lisa who had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would sleep with a nightlight on and refused to go into dark places like basements or attics. As she grew older, her fear of the dark never went away. She would still sleep with a nightlight on and avoid going out at night whenever possible. One day, Lisa moved into a new apartment. It was a nice place, but there was one problem: the bedroom didn't have any windows. At first, she didn't think much of it, but as the days went by, she began to feel more and more uneasy. She started having nightmares about being trapped in a dark room with no way out. The nightmares became so intense that Lisa began to lose sleep. She would lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close her eyes. She started to feel like something was watching her, even though she knew she was alone in the apartment. One night, Lisa heard a noise coming from the closet. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was just her imagination, but the noise grew louder and more persistent. Finally, she got out of bed and walked over to the closet. She hesitated for a moment before opening the door, but when she did, she found nothing inside. Despite finding nothing in the closet, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She started to see strange shadows moving across the walls at night, and she heard strange whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. She started to wonder if she was losing her mind. One day, Lisa decided to try to face her fear of the dark head-on. She turned off all the lights in the apartment and sat in the darkness, trying to calm her nerves. As she sat there, she heard the sound of someone breathing. She turned on the lights, but there was no one there. From that day on, Lisa couldn't bear to be alone in the apartment. She moved out soon after, never knowing if the things she experienced were real or just a product of her imagination. Samantha had always been a bit of a perfectionist. She constantly obsessed over every detail of her appearance, spending hours in front of the mirror each day. But lately, she had noticed something strange. Every time she looked at a reflection, she felt like it was staring back at her with a sinister glint in its eye. At first, Samantha tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just her imagination. But the feeling only grew stronger with each passing day. Soon, she found herself avoiding mirrors altogether, afraid of what she might see. One night, Samantha decided to confront her fears. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, forcing herself to meet her reflection's gaze. As she stared into the glass, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection was grinning at her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Samantha stumbled backwards, tripping over the bathmat and falling to the ground. As she lay there, she heard a voice whispering in her ear, "I am you, and you are me. We are one and the same." From that moment on, Samantha was never the same. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that her reflection was out to get her. She stopped leaving the house, afraid to face the world outside. And every time she looked in a mirror, she saw the same malevolent grin staring back at her. In the end, Samantha was found dead in her apartment, surrounded by shattered mirrors. The police ruled it a suicide, but some say that she was driven to madness by the sinister presence in her reflection, and that it was her own reflection that drove her to take her own life. There was once a woman named Lily who lived alone in a small apartment. She had always been a bit anxious, but lately, her anxiety had grown worse. She felt like she was constantly being watched, and every little noise made her jump. One day, Lily came home from work to find that her apartment had been broken into. Nothing was missing, but everything was out of place. Lily was terrified. She called the police, but they didn't find any evidence of a break-in. From that day on, Lily's anxiety became unbearable. She stopped leaving her apartment, stopped going to work, and stopped talking to her friends. She was convinced that someone was watching her, even when she was alone. One night, Lily was lying in bed, trying to calm herself down, when she heard a noise coming from the other room. She was frozen with fear, too scared to move. But the noise continued, getting louder and louder. Finally, Lily mustered up the courage to investigate. She crept out of bed and slowly made her way to the other room. When she turned on the light, she saw that her worst fears had come true. There was no one in the room but herself. The noise she had heard was only in her head. From that day on, Lily sought help for her anxiety. She learned that sometimes, the scariest things are the ones we create in our own minds. John had always been a confident and charismatic man. He had a successful career and a loving family, but he had a dark secret that haunted him every day. Years ago, he had committed a murder, and he had managed to cover his tracks so well that no one ever suspected him. But the guilt ate away at him, and he knew that he could never truly escape the consequences of his actions. As time went on, John's mental health began to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid and anxious, always looking over his shoulder and jumping at every little sound. He couldn't sleep at night, haunted by nightmares of the person he had killed. He began to drink heavily, hoping to drown out the guilt and the fear. Despite his best efforts to keep up appearances, John's behavior began to attract attention. His colleagues at work started to notice that he seemed on edge all the time, and his family grew worried about his erratic behavior. But John refused to seek help, convinced that he could handle his problems on his own. One night, after a particularly heavy drinking session, John's mental state finally reached a breaking point. He couldn't take it anymore, couldn't live with the guilt and the fear and the shame. In a moment of desperation, he took his own life, leaving behind a devastated family and a legacy of secrets and lies. The police investigated John's death, but they never uncovered the truth about the murder he had committed. To the world, he was just another tragic suicide. But for those who knew him best, they knew that his death was the result of a lifetime of guilt and psychological torment. Once there was a man named David who always felt like he was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling of being observed by other people, but something much more eerie and unsettling. He would often catch glimpses of a shadowy figure out of the corner of his eye, but whenever he turned to face it, there was nothing there. At first, David tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the feeling persisted, and soon it began to consume his thoughts day and night. He became increasingly paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at the slightest sound. As time went on, David's mental state began to deteriorate. He started to see the shadowy figure more frequently, and it seemed to be getting closer and closer every time. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that the figure was standing at the foot of his bed. David's friends and family grew concerned about his well-being and tried to persuade him to seek help. But David was convinced that nobody would understand what he was going through. He became increasingly isolated and started to lose touch with reality. One night, as David was walking home from work, he felt the presence of the shadowy figure behind him. He quickened his pace, but it seemed to be keeping up with him. He could feel its breath on the back of his neck, and he knew that he was running out of time. In a moment of desperation, David turned to face the figure. To his horror, he saw that it was not a shadowy apparition, but a manifestation of his own inner demons. He realized that the figure was a product of his own imagination, a manifestation of his deepest fears and insecurities. The realization was too much for David to bear. The psychological pressure had become too great, and he could no longer cope with the weight of his own mind. He fell to the ground, writhing in agony, and slipped into a catatonic state. David was taken to a mental institution, where he remained for the rest of his life. His family and friends could only look on helplessly as the man they once knew slowly faded away, consumed by the darkness that had haunted him for so many years. Once there was a man named Jack who always felt like his life was being dictated by unseen forces. He would try to make positive changes in his life, only to find himself in situations that seemed to be warning him against it. He would feel like he was being watched, as if something was trying to keep him in his current cycle of existence. Whenever Jack tried to break out of his routine, he would experience strange occurrences that seemed to be warning him of danger. For example, when he decided to quit his job and pursue a new career, he received a letter in the mail that warned him of the dangers of taking such a big risk. When he tried to move to a new city, he received a phone call from an unknown number that warned him of the dangers of leaving his comfort zone. No matter what Jack did, he always felt like he was being watched and controlled by some unseen force. His fear and paranoia grew with each passing day, and he started to believe that he was being targeted by some sort of supernatural entity. As Jack's paranoia reached its peak, he began to see visions of demons and other horrific creatures. They would taunt him, telling him that he was doomed to fail and that his efforts to break free were futile. Eventually, Jack's fear and paranoia became too much to bear, and he took his own life. As his body was discovered, a strange note was found nearby. It read, "I try to break free, but life was always watching me. It's too powerful to fight against, and I am finally giving up." No one knows for sure what happened to Jack, but some believe that he was indeed being controlled by unseen forces. His story serves as a warning to those who feel like they are stuck in their current situation and are looking to break free. Sometimes, it's best to accept the hand that life has dealt you, rather than try to fight against it. Mia had always been a vivid dreamer. She had grown used to the occasional nightmare, but lately they had become more frequent and more disturbing. Every night, she would be tormented by terrible visions of monsters, ghosts, and demons. They felt so real that she would often wake up sweating and trembling with fear. As the weeks went on, Mia's nightmares began to affect her waking life. She found it hard to concentrate at work, and she started to withdraw from her friends and family. She became obsessed with trying to figure out why she was having these dreams and what they meant. One night, Mia had a particularly vivid nightmare. In it, she was being chased by a faceless figure through a dark and twisted maze. She could hear its footsteps getting closer and closer, and she knew that if it caught her, she would never escape. When she woke up, she was gasping for air and covered in sweat. She tried to shake off the feeling of terror, but it lingered with her all day. That night, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She went to a sleep specialist and begged for something to help her sleep. The specialist prescribed Mia a powerful sedative, and she started taking it every night. At first, it seemed to work. She was able to sleep through the night without any nightmares. But then, something strange started to happen. Mia began to experience vivid hallucinations during the day. She would see shadowy figures lurking in the corners of her vision, and she would hear whispers and voices that no one else could hear. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality. One night, Mia had a particularly intense nightmare. In it, she was trapped in a dark room with no doors or windows. The walls were closing in on her, and she could feel the air getting thinner and thinner. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. When she woke up, she realized that she was actually trapped in a dark room. She had sleepwalked out of her bedroom and into the storage closet. She felt like she was losing her mind. Mia decided to stop taking the sedative, but it was too late. Her nightmares had already done their damage. She was never the same again. She would often have episodes of paranoia and hallucinations. She felt like she was being watched all the time, even when she was alone. In the end, her chronic nightmares had driven her to the brink of insanity. Once there was a man named Paul, who had lived through a tragedy that took the lives of everyone he loved. Paul was the sole survivor of a disaster that struck his town, and he was left with a profound sense of guilt and sadness. In the years that followed, Paul's mind began to play tricks on him, and he became convinced that the ghosts of his friends and family were haunting him. At first, Paul thought he was just imagining things. He would hear strange noises in his empty house, or catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye. But as time went on, the hauntings became more intense. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find his deceased wife sitting at the edge of his bed, or his deceased son standing in the corner of the room, staring at him with empty eyes. As the hauntings grew more frequent and intense, Paul's mental health began to decline rapidly. He became paranoid, convinced that the ghosts were angry with him for surviving the disaster while they all perished. He started seeing signs of their anger everywhere he went, on TV, in the news, in his dreams. Paul's obsession with the hauntings soon consumed his life. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped leaving his house altogether. His mind became a prison, and the ghosts of his loved ones were his only company. In the end, Paul could no longer bear the weight of his guilt and the haunting illusions in his mind. He believed that his loved ones were seeking revenge on him for surviving, and he could not handle the constant torment. So, he took his own life, hoping to escape the haunting and join his loved ones in the afterlife. The tragedy of Paul's story is a reminder of how easily the human mind can be broken by trauma and grief. The hauntings that he experienced were the manifestation of his own pain and guilt, and his inability to move on ultimately led to his own demise. Jenny had always been a bit of a loner. She was shy and kept to herself, preferring to spend her days lost in thought or buried in a book. Her parents tried to get her involved in extracurricular activities, but she always found an excuse to avoid them. One day, Jenny's parents decided to send her to a summer camp to help her make some friends and gain some independence. At first, Jenny was hesitant, but she eventually agreed to go. The first few days at camp were difficult for Jenny. She struggled to connect with the other campers and often found herself sitting alone during activities. But one day, she met a girl named Sarah who seemed to understand her. They bonded over their shared love of books and spent hours talking about their favorite stories. As the weeks went on, Jenny's relationship with Sarah grew stronger. They were inseparable and spent every moment together. But then, one day, Sarah disappeared. No one seemed to know what happened to her. The camp counselors searched everywhere, but there was no sign of her. Jenny was devastated. She spent the rest of the summer searching for Sarah, but to no avail. When Jenny returned home, she was a different person. She had become withdrawn and quiet, spending most of her time alone in her room. Her parents tried to talk to her, but she refused to open up. It wasn't until several months later that Jenny's parents began to notice something strange. Jenny had started talking to herself, often carrying on long conversations with someone who wasn't there. She seemed to be living in a world of her own, detached from reality. Her parents took her to see a therapist, but nothing seemed to help. Jenny's mental state continued to deteriorate. She became paranoid, convinced that Sarah was still out there somewhere and that she was in danger. One day, Jenny disappeared. Her parents searched everywhere for her, but there was no sign of her. It wasn't until several weeks later that her body was found in the woods, just a few miles from her home. The autopsy revealed that she had died of exposure, but there was something else that caught the attention of the investigators. They found scratch marks on the inside of her wrists, as if she had been trying to escape from something. To this day, no one knows what really happened to Jenny. Some say she was haunted by the ghost of Sarah, while others believe she simply couldn't cope with the loss of her friend. But one thing is for certain, the mystery surrounding her death still haunts the town to this day.